Last of Us fanfiction, written by Aster. Chapter 4, Huntersville. Then, the army had set up the Huntersville quarantine zone. Dozens of feet shuffled in uneven rhythm as Joel and Tommy were waved forward as they came to the front of the line.
And identification?
Just me.
You're related.
Brothers, we were at the triage in Leyland for a few days.
You got out before everything damn shit hit the fan. A few days ago, they called to say they were infected in the triage. Ain't heard nothing since then.
They say how infected got it?
It's a fungus. Puts out spores like mushrooms. You breathe them in, you get infected, just the same as if you'd been bitten.
Anyone?
He resumed running his finger down the list of names.
No family, but you know who else is in Austin? Bonnie Hops. That's real good for her. We can be the two brothers who the bosses around here count on. Which ones you think will keep getting their rations if things ever go real bad? Jesus, Joe. Only way we beat this thing is working together.
Infected. Outside.
They're not infected. They're not infected. They're not shooting the infected, Joe. They're not shooting the infected.
The street gleamed slick, red, blood.
So much for working together.
Now. August 12th, 2014, 1:30 p.m.
You know what they never tell you about the apocalypse? How goddamn long it takes to do goddamn anything.
The other barricade crewmen chuckled as knives and forks clattered across plates. They sat clustered around a pile of broken cement slabs, recognizable by the bright green reflective vests they each wore. Today's lunch was a rare treat. Barbecue chicken and rice, with half a peach to each man.
No, serious now.
Javier continued with mock seriousness, egged on by the grins of his comrades.
We'd have been finished this goddamn wall a week ago if we had even a single fucking backhoe. Please, dear God, in your infinite wisdom, please see fit to drop upon this miserable place at least a goddamn bobcat that runs. And world peace. End of the plague, all that too.
That earned another round of laughter from the crewmen, who sat with backs against broken cement and lunches balanced on their knees. Even Joel smiled as he silently used a small knife to carve thin slices off of his peach. Grinning at the attention, Javier set aside his empty plate and dug into a shirt pocket, pulling out a pack of cigarettes. As he lit one using a box of matches, he muttered dramatically,
I ever meet any of them Hollywood producers, I'm gonna tell them they got it all wrong. Less crazy shit and special effects.
He said, now waving the lit cigarette around with exaggerated disdain.
More walking and carrying shit and walking some more. Fucking blockbuster, am I right?
Tommy smiled and shook his head, scraping up the last of his barbecue sauce into his remaining rice. The crewmen gradually devolved into their own conversations, leaving Javier to suck quietly on his cigarette as he leaned forward onto his knees, balanced between two slabs of cement. Tommy and Joel sat just below him, sweat beading their brows and staining the arms and necklines of their ratty work shirts. The Texas summer sun was not gentle, but the overripe peaches were going some way towards alleviating the oppressive heat. Perched like a king atop his mountain, Javier reached down to nudge Tommy's arm, nodding towards the line of civilians marshalling outside the ration distribution tent. Several of them were casting dirty looks in the direction of the barricade crewmen.
What you think, Tommy boy?
Javier grinned.
You think those pendejos just like the view over here or something?
Tommy followed Javier's not-so-subtle gesture towards the people lining up for their rations. Several of them raised curled lips when they spotted Javier and Tommy looking in their direction. Their own lunch would also consist of rice, but with only canned peas to supplement.
Must be your good looks and that sparkling personality, Hov.
Tommy returned sarcastically, keeping his voice low and casting his eyes downward. Tommy actually quite liked Javier, with his irreverent sense of humor and his shameless thirst for attention. It was a welcome relief from the otherwise dull and depressing QZ life. Javier was a couple years older than Joel, round-faced and brown-skinned, with the greasy mass of black hair that he kept under an even greasier old ball cap. He claimed to have been in road construction before the outbreak, but he really had two main talents: making people laugh and pissing people off. As if to prove that point, Javier laughed aloud and nudged Tommy again, as if he had told some great joke. The expressions of the people in line darkened still further, and several began muttering to one another.
Don't look so offended, Tommy boy. They should be grateful they got my good looks to look at. Without the likes of you and me, they don't get the precious wall, do they? They don't like their rations. Tough shit. They're eating, ain't they? More than some folk in Austin can say, eh?
Tommy glanced up at Javier with a frown and lifted brows, a look of mock conciliation.
You've got a way of putting it in perspective, huh?
He said, tone again sarcastic, but not reproachful.
That's why he's got so many fans.
Joel chipped in unexpectedly, expression half smug as he cut off another sliver of peach without looking up. Tommy shook his head and smiled. Their time on the barricade crew had helped to lift some of Joel's abiding black mood, and for that, Tommy was grateful. Even if Joel still kept to himself more often than not.
Why are there noses in it, though?
Tommy said, more seriously this time as he glanced back towards the civilians waiting for their rations.
Captain Hogan doesn't want the protests at the Astro getting worse. Folks are already uneasy about Austin.
Uneasy was an understatement. Huntersville had moved from uneasy to angry when the first riots had broken out a week ago. It had been 3 months since Austin's agricultural teams, operating outside the wall, had been overrun by infected. Word had it that the city had seen continuous riots for over a month now. In response, the capital had more than halved the amount of food it sent out to the smaller zones, with the result that Huntersville had begun organizing volunteer salvage teams to sweep nearby towns for supplies. In the first week, 2 teams had never returned, and a third had limped back with news that armed bandits roamed the highways north of Huntersville. After that, the volunteers had dried up and the conscriptions had begun. Every civilian rotated through the salvage teams now, age and health permitting. And all but a favored few, most notably the barricade crews, were causing increasing unrest in protest at the continuing mandatory excursions. But if Javier was concerned about making a scene, he didn't show it. He waved his cigarette dismissively, leaving a trail of smoke to disperse in the air in front of him.
They got something to say to us, then just say it. Fucking people don't have the balls to do it. They want our rations, but you think they want our job? No fucking way, amigo.
He raised his voice loud enough so that those in line could hear.
'Cause God forbid the infected carry our useless asses away.
Snorting and shaking his head at the half-angry, half-confused expression of those who had heard him, Javier lowered his voice again.
People like you and me, Tommy boy. We've been dealing with people like them our whole lives. Welcome to the new world, folks, where you lazy pendejos don't get to leech off the work of better men. Am I right, Joel?
Right, Puff.
Joel replied vaguely. Javier laughed aloud again.
Ha, you see? Your brother's a smart man, Tommy boy. Smarter than most here. Keep him close, eh?
But Joel didn't chuckle. Instead, he abruptly shifted from where he lounged with his back against a slab of cement.
Whoa now,
He said.
what's this?
He was looking at the line of angry onlookers as he slowly leaned forward. Tommy followed his brother's gaze. Several of those in line had abandoned their plates and were headed towards the barricade crew with looks that could have boiled water. Joel set aside his peach and wiped his knife on his jeans as he stood. But Tommy noticed he did not flip the pocket knife closed afterward. Javier's smile faded, but his expression remained smug, as if savoring the opportunity for a fight.
Well now,
He said, standing and rubbing his hands together, cigarettes dangling from his lips.
Somebody got a pair of brass ones after all.
The group neared them, and Javier suddenly beamed, clapping his hands together in approval.
I'd have guessed you, Charlie.
Charlie was short for Charlotte, the woman who stood at the head of the approaching group. She was 30-something, short and square. A messy braid of black hair framed a face that might have been pretty had it not been glowering at them. She pulled up in front of Javier, and the barricade crew went quiet, as did half the dozen people following in Charlie's wake.
Have you got a problem with us?
She demanded, her voice betraying the fact that she was no native of the Lone Star State. She eyed Joel and Tommy where they stood behind Javier.
Why, I sure do, honey.
Javier replied casually, as if nothing in the world were more obvious. He waited for her to reply, but leapt at the chance to continue when she merely snorted indignantly.
Oh, nothing to say? Here, let me help. You barricaders!
He said, in a mockingly high-pitched voice.
You think you're all that, with your better rations and coffee twice a week and your pretty green vests. It's just not fair. I want a pretty green vest too.
Charlie's cheeks grew redder than the Texas sun could make them.
If you're so smart, Javier, then why don't you actually try answering?
She hissed.
What gives you the right to better rations? We all go outside the wall now.
What? Once a month?
Javier snorted derisively.
Try daily, babe. You wanna cry about 8 poor souls in a month? Try 62 in a fucking year. Try fucking volunteering.
The barricade crew behind Javier crowded their agreement, shouting down the angry cries that suddenly broke out behind Charlie. Charlie herself looked fit to spit.
We're all doing our part, you son of a bitch. What makes you think you're better than the rest of us?
Javier laughed mockingly, spreading his arms wide as if to shrug.
Ain't me, precious.
He pointed skyward.
It's the powers that be that are feeding me better than you.
That was it. With a howl of rage, Charlie launched herself at Javier, despite the fact that he stood a good half a head over her. Javier's smug mirth gave way to anger, and he braced for her impact. From beside Javier, Joel moved unexpectedly quickly, stepping to Charlie's side as she lunged forward and wrapping an arm over one of her shoulders and across her chest so that he could hold her from behind.
Ah!
She had a powerful amount of rage, but nowhere near Joel's strength.
Joel, fucking let me go!
She screamed, fingernails digging into the skin of Joel's forearm.
Get the fuck off me!
She tried to kick behind her to no avail.
Charlie just...
Joel started to say, but his words turned to a grunt of surprise and pain as one of Charlie's companions swung a fist and caught Joel just behind the left ear. In an instant, the barricade men were on their feet, chicken and peaches forgotten, as they suddenly swarmed around their attackers, outnumbering them 2-1. Angry shouts filled the air, and reflective green vests flashed as those on both sides sought to land punches amidst the mashup of bodies, with Javier and Charlie at the center. Tommy found himself swept up into it, yelling as he fought to keep the non-barricaders from pummeling Javier or Joel. Without the clearance for a proper punch, however, Tommy mostly just found himself pushing against flailing limbs and grabbing at the edges of clothing. Someone yanked at his collar, briefly choking him until Joel kicked behind him and the pressure on Tommy's throat released. He saw a hand holding a fork flash in front of him. At one point, he felt his fingers jab at something soft that he suspected was someone's eye. A couple of people fell to the dusty ground and fought against a tangle of legs. It took gunshots to bring the fight to a halt. Barricaders and non-barricaders stumbled back from one another, searching wildly for the source of gunfire. A row of soldiers stood with assault rifles aimed at the brawlers, and at their center stood a young lieutenant with a pistol held aloft. He did not look pleased. Several people lay on the ground, including Charlie. Both Javier and Joel were still standing, but Javier looked to have been the victim of the fork that Tommy had spotted. The 4 bloody lines across his right cheekbone were any clue. As for Joel, he was nursing a bloody nose, in addition to the scratches Charlie has left across his arm.
What the hell's going on here?
The lieutenant demanded, slowly lowering his firearm.
We demand to know why barricade crews get better treatment than anyone else in the zone.
Charlie was struggling up from the dust, spitting and snorting, but no less angry as she rounded on the lieutenant.
God damn it, Charlie.
Joel growled, wiping a sleeve across his mouth to mop up some of the blood that had soaked into his beard and trickled across his lips.
Are you really gonna get into this again?
Yes, Joel.
Charlie returned, with just as much growl in her voice. She planted her hands on her hips.
I'll keep asking until I get an answer.
Oh, you've already had an answer, sweetheart.
Javier spat impatiently as he stooped and swept his ball cap up from the ground, where it had fallen in the scuffle.
No liking it ain't the same as no having it.
His cheek was slick with blood from where the fork had dragged deep scratches across his brown skin. Dust coated half of his face and had been ground into his hair. Although grimacing at the sight, Tommy looked annoyed as he dug into his back pocket and pulled out a sweaty kerchief, which he threw at Javier.
Jeez, Hav,
He said angrily.
you ain't helping. Just bleed for a while and shut the fuck up.
Enough!
The army lieutenant barked. He had not holstered his sidearm, but he held it pointed at the ground.
All of you, clean yourselves up and leave these folks alone.
He said, pointing at Javier and the other green-vested barricade crewmen.
And you, miss.
He continued, glaring now at Charlie and her comrades.
Captain Hogan has already explained why the barricaders get premium rations. They're on the wall daily and do some of the hardest physical work in the zone. You got a problem with that explanation? You take it up with the captain.
We're not stupid, Commander.
Charlie protested, arms crossed.
Our Fedra dictators are fattening up the strong and powerful in the zone because the writing's on the wall. When things go south, you want them to stand beside you.
Ma'am.
The lieutenant growled in a deceptively quiet tone, patience vanishing.
Leave. Now.
Charlie looked as if she was willing to challenge the officer's ultimatum. But at just that moment, the unmistakable wallop of a helicopter's blades cut the hot summer afternoon air. All eyes turned skyward, to the southwest, where a swamp-green military Huey was rapidly approaching Huntersville, heading for the makeshift helipad that had been set up in the Astro parking lot, where the Federal Disaster Response Agency had made its headquarters when it had finally reached Huntersville around Christmas last year.
All right.
One of the other barricade crewmen cried out, fight forgotten as he punched the air triumphantly.
Austin News, about fucking time.
Both barricaders and non-barricaders alike began grinning. Even as tense as things were now, news from Austin was always a treat. A fragile reminder that Huntersville was not alone in this pandemic-stricken world. With a huff, Charlie turned on her heel and headed back towards the ration line, her followers in tow. The barricade crew began gathering up their things, intent on heading to the Astro and hearing what the word was from Austin before returning to their work.
Come on, come on.
Joe mumbled as they turned away from the lieutenant and soldiers.
Let's go see about Austin.
Another bunny letter, huh?
Javier said with a wicked grin, jabbing an elbow into Joel's side as if it were a normal day, and they were not both nursing bloody faces. Joel didn't respond, but he did snort into the rag he was now holding under his nose.
Two and out, didn't they?
Tommy said as he gathered up their plates and silverware.
Wonder why the second stayed in Austin.
Might have gone to another zone.
Joel grunted.
Yeah. Maybe.
The arrival of an Austin helicopter usually drew crowds hungry for news or letters from loved ones. By the time they arrived at the Astro parking lot, the helicopter they had seen approaching had already landed and was powering down. Eager onlookers were clustered around the wooden barriers that the military had thrown up around the helipad. But people tended to make way for the green vests that distinguished the barricade crews. And Joe, Tommy, and Javier managed to elbow their way to the front, standing at the extreme edge of the helipad, near the Astromart. Soldiers were scurrying back and forth around the building, with greater vigor and more shouting than Tommy would have expected. Something felt off. A young private emerged from the Astro, holding a large industrial first aid kit. It was John Gregory, the very same private who had once taken down Joel and Tommy's names and information when they had first come to Huntersville.
John,
Tommy said, loudly enough for Gregory to hear, but not enough to attract the attention of the other soldiers rushing around the headquarters. For a moment, Gregory looked like a deer in the headlights, but he visibly relaxed when he caught sight of Tommy waving at him. Tommy had never had difficulty earning the trust of others. Where Joel preferred to shirk attention and keep his head down, Tommy felt most at ease when he was in the midst of everything, so that he could keep a finger on it all. And John Gregory, fortunately, was one of the most reliable gossips in Huntersville's military.
What's going on, John?
Tommy said. He kept his voice light-hearted, but he could feel the uneasy edge creeping into it.
They usually unloading the mail by now. But y'all are acting like y'all got a fire under you.
Ain't good, boys.
Gregory whispered, nodding to both brothers and Javier.
Ain't gonna be any mail this time, maybe not for a while.
He swallowed and lowered his voice, motioning for them to lean in.
You heard anything?
Tommy shook his head. Gregory let a hushed breath escape his lips, shaking his head.
Austin's out of control. Rioters are ripping into Fedra there.
He paused a moment to let that sink in, then nodded softly towards the helicopter.
They got our second chopper.
Joel's brow furrowed, his dark eyes suddenly wary.
What do you mean they got it?
Broke into Austin's airfield and took it. Wouldn't let our boys near it. The fellas in this one barely got airborne before fucking rioters rushed them. They were shooting at them, fucking shoot at them as they were flying off.
Joel shifted to look around Gregory. Tommy followed his brother's gaze to the now silent helicopter. Sure enough, bullet holes were visible on its undercarriage and on the bottom half of one of the doors. One of the soldiers clustered around the aircraft moved, giving Tommy a clear view of the interior of the helicopter. A woman in a blue Fedra uniform was lying on the floor, squirming in apparent pain as soldiers with red gloves hovered around her. Tommy sucked in a breath, and Joel shot him a meaningful look.
Look, boys,
Gregory muttered.
I gotta go. Hogan's planning on trouble. We were making an announcement tonight, but the captain is gonna be looking for civilian volunteers to help keep things calm here. If Austin's offline right now, we are talking no extra supplies, no letters. And Fedra Central Command is gonna have its hands full, not gonna be bothering with any of the smaller zones. You boys think about stepping up, alright?
Right.
Joel said without conviction, before either Tommy or Javier could respond. Tommy felt his lips part as Gregory turned and began jogging towards the helicopter. The young private's revelation felt like a hammer that they had watched falling for 3 months. It was no surprise when it finally hit, but it still hurt like hell. There was something innately grounding about Austin. Every time a chopper or convoy of trucks arrived from the capital, they were greeted by eager crowds. Mail drops were celebratory events as people waited to hear from loved ones or from pen pals that they had never met but had exchanged letters with as part of Fedra's morale maintenance program. Austin sent food and water. Austin sent guns and ammunition. Austin sent soldiers, trucks, building materials, barbed wire. And Austin sent orders. It was the center of Fedra's command hierarchy in Central Texas, the hub around which the smaller QZs revolved and coordinated efforts to combat the pandemic. In everything, Austin was structure. It was safety. And now, it was under siege.
Jesus.
Tommy breathed, looking at Joel.
Austin's falling apart.
Which means Huntersville might not be far behind.
Joel muttered. He was quiet for a moment, then drew a slow, deep breath. He nodded at Javier.
Your buddy Charlie might have been right, Hav, if they're looking for barricade crews to step up.
Javier crossed his arms and allowed a deliberately childish pout to pucker his lips.
Fuck if I'm gonna admit it.
August 20th, 2014, 7:15 a.m. Tommy stared at his reflection in the broken mirror. He looked haggard, but that seemed unshakable here in the quarantine zone. Haunted, maybe? Troubled. strain of the past week was apparent in the dark circles beneath his eyes and the tight muscles of his clenched jaw. Creases cut across his face around his eyes and mouth, and his cheeks, already brown from long hours under the sun, were growing splotchy from poor sleep. He had let his beard grow in, but it was ragged and thin. A year ago, he might have been mistaken for one of the homeless that roamed the street in Austin. Vaguely, Tommy found himself wondering how much remained of the man he had been a year ago.
Tommy.
He turned away from the mirror to find Joel watching him with a look of disapproval, as if his brother had guessed Tommy's thoughts. Joel was like that. He didn't talk about the way things had been, except on a superficial level, such as when Javier would joke about all the perks of the old world, like football and porn. Even when Joel had anything to add in the letters they sent to Bonnie in Austin every few weeks, he would avoid any talk about Perkins or how things used to be, and ask instead how she was faring now.
Come on,
Joel said, waving.
They'll be there by now.
Nodding distractedly, Tommy pushed away from the table he had been standing in front of, with his basin of room-temperature water and a broken mirror. 4 beds occupied the former living room of the apartment in which they made their residence, but Tommy and Joel were currently alone. The sun was already risen and shining burnt orange across the living room carpet. Returning to his bed, Tommy grabbed his green vest and the brown hunting rifle that leaned against the wall next to the bed. Joel was waiting at the front door for him, and together they left the apartment and began descending the flight of stairs to the ground level.
You hear the rioters last night?
Tommy asked as they walked, hefting the rifle strapped over his shoulder once he had donned his vest. Joel nodded.
They're still going. You hear them up on the roof?
The roof. Joel seemed to spend a lot of time alone on the roof of their apartment building. That he could hear the rioters from up there was no surprise. For a week, they had entrenched themselves along several of the side streets that immediately flanked the Astromart complex, occasionally venturing out from their makeshift walls of tables and stacked file cabinets to throw bricks and bottles at the soldiers who guarded the main federal headquarters at the Astro. Lines of soldiers in riot gear now surrounded the place 24/7. Tear gas and rubber bullets were beginning to run in short supply. The brothers found Javier and the rest of the barricade crew at the far north of the Huntersville zone, where a long sliding gate granted entry through the zone's 15-foot-high cement wall. There were plans to build the wall higher, but the barricade crew was currently working long days in order to construct a second gate, one that would go right behind the first and allow those entering the zone to go through standard decontamination procedures behind the relative safety of a gate, without first fully entering Huntersville. Every person and vehicle that entered Huntersville went through decontamination, which at the moment took place outside the wall. More than once, however, vehicles had returned with a pack of runners hot on their heels, and if outsiders could not be decontaminated before the infected reached the wall, well, the gate opened for no man if there were infected near. The skeleton of the second gate was spread out on the ground besides the first gate. Several crewmen were working to install new sections of wall into which the new gate would eventually slide when opened, while others were bent over the half-finished gate itself, constructed primarily from the cannibalized remnants of an old railroad container. The area hummed with the sound of generators and the crack of hammers.
Well, just in time for the fun.
Javier was bent over the new gate, with the welding gun in one hand and the welding helmet covering his face. But he straightened and lifted the helmet up as soon as he caught sight of Tommy and Joel approaching. He was grinning, despite the 4 long scabs that marred the right side of his face.
Truck's coming in, boys.
Joel lifted a brow, and Tommy looked up at the ramparts of the wall that stood above them. The soldiers on the wall were gesturing to one another and pointing, indicating that a truck was indeed outside and currently going through decontamination.
One of ours?
Joel asked. He set down his rifle against the wall and started to roll up the sleeves of his dirty grey checkered shirt.
Went out yesterday afternoon. Don't even look like he's got any infected following it. Lucky day, hey?
Javier was still smiling, but Joel and Tommy nodded in all earnestness. The riots around the Astro had reached a feverish level in the past week, and the noise seemed to have drawn more infected to the area. The sound of gunfire was part and parcel of QZ life. but it had been several months since the wall had been assailed by the number of runners that they had seen in the past week. Now, you could almost count the hours by the frequency with which automatic rifle fire cracked across the sky. Every barricader now carried a firearm of some sort, issued by the military ostensibly to protect against the increasing attacks by infected. It was no secret, however, that Captain Hogan of Fedra Huntersville Command wanted a show of force throughout the zone in an attempt to quell the riots.
Here we go!
One of the soldiers on the wall shouted. The barricade crew looked up and moved away as soldiers on the ground began to unlock the old gate and slide it back in order to make way for the truck waiting outside. As the gate rolled back, it revealed a military transport truck, mottled green and idling, hopefully with a plethora of salvaged goods stowed away under its canvas top. It started to roll forward through the gate. Without warning, a brownish red object flew through the air almost in slow motion, arcing over the heads of the barricade crew, before smashing into the windshield of the truck. The driver slammed on the brakes with an audible angry cry of,
What the hell?
Who threw that?
An officer on the wall suddenly shouted, glaring at those gathered on the ground below. But the barricaders were looking behind them. The wall had been built at the far side of a wide street, and within the zone and across the street from the wall, a row of squat empty office buildings hunkered over a series of black alleys filled with abandoned garbage cans and idle cars. People with bandanas wrapped across their faces were now spilling from those alleys, clutching broken bottles, bricks, pipes, and splintered planks of wood as weapons. A cry rose up from their ranks.
Rioters!
Tommy shouted, swinging his rifle off his shoulder as other barricade crewmen scrambled to retrieve their firearms.
They want a fucking truck.
Javier snorted, as if personally offended that the rioters would even contemplate interfering with business on the wall. He flicked the safety off of the revolver he had been issued. The rioters were pouring into the street, perhaps 50 or 60 in all. Crowds at the Astro had been far more substantial, but not near as well armed. If this group intended to take the truck, they did not intend to do so peaceably. The officer on the wall, a sandy-haired lieutenant, suddenly lifted a loudspeaker in one hand and a pistol in the other.
Stop where you are!
The lieutenant's voice crackled through the loudspeaker.
Stop now, or we will be forced to open fire. We have live ammo.
If the rioters heard the lieutenant's warning, they chose to ignore it. Tommy glanced sidelong at Joel. Both brothers had raised their rifles to point at the rushing rioters and formed a line in front of the open gate with their fellow barricaders. Soldiers on the wall were aiming assault rifles inward towards the rioters.
Fucking tell her we're not gonna do this.
Tommy breathed out, as if talking to himself, blinking rapidly. The rioters were at a dead run now and closing fast, 200 feet away from the wall.
Let's keep going!
Just stop!
Tommy!
Joel snapped, staring down the barrel of his rifle. His tone said more than words could. It demanded that Tommy get his head in the game and focus, right now. Everyone was shouting. A cacophony of cries went up from soldiers and barricaders alike, all screaming for the splintered rioters to stop. Tommy felt his palms go cold as images of a dark November night 9 months ago flashed before his eyes. This was going to be a bloodbath.
Joel, we can't do this.
Tommy gritted through clenched teeth.
We can't do this. This is wrong, Joel.
The rioters were 100 feet away.
Tommy!
Joel growled without elaboration again, his voice rising now. Tommy hadn't lowered his rifle, but he was shaking his head, eyes wide.
We can't do this. Joel.
He repeated. The rioters were 50 feet away from the wall. They were going to do this. They were really going to do it. Above the shouting, an inhuman cry rang out. He stumbled forward, the barrel of his rifle falling to point at the ground as he caught a flash of bright green to his side, indicating he had been pushed by a fellow barricader. He turned to look behind him, still half confused, even as instinct told him what he would see. Infected were pouring through the gate like locusts descending on a field. The idling military truck remained blocking the gate, leaving the zone wide open to uninhibited entry. Tommy watched as runners with bloodshot eyes and curled hands pulled the unfortunate driver from the cab of the truck and dragged him to the ground, broken fingernails clawing at the man's face and chest. Other infected were already through the gate, and several set upon a barricader who had been standing near the wall. The poor man twisted and flailed as the infected tore at him. The rifle he had been holding abruptly discharged, and Tommy saw one of the soldiers on the wall jerk as the erratic bullet struck him. All of this took only a handful of seconds to process, but even as Tommy turned away from the gate to flee the onset of the infected, the wave of rushing rioters, briefly forgotten, slammed into the line of barricade men. Chaos descended. Tommy suddenly felt as if every shouting voice, every inhuman scream, blurred into a single uniform din. Gunfire erupted all around him, but amidst the tangle of scrambling bodies, he could not tell if those falling to the ground were felled by shots or infected. A runner appeared in front of him, a woman with grey hair and pulsing veins across her face, and he brought his rifle to bear on her, instinctively pulling the trigger before he could even think of a response. She jolted backwards by the force of the bullet, a sprouting red hole opening up just under her throat, then tumbled forward to the dusty ground. Another runner, this one barely out of his teens, suddenly grabbed Tommy's arm and opened his mouth, eyes wild as he prepared to bite. Tommy swung the butt of his rifle up, jerking his arm out of the infected's grasp and slamming the stock of his guns into the infected's temple. The runner stumbled with an anguished cry and poured at his head where the rifle had struck him. Tommy spun and fired, a bullet ripping through both the runner's hand and head, driving him to the ground. A wriggling thought tugged at the back of Tommy's mind. Where was Joel? How had Tommy lost track of Joel? Dust filled the air, and Tommy began to feel the oppressive realization that he was trapped. The rioters were turning to flee the infected, but they were not moving fast enough. Runners were still pouring through the gate, moving with inhuman speed, overwhelming those on the ground, now pounding their way up the steps to reach the soldiers on the wall. He would die here. Tommy would die in this dusty, miserable place, and his body would be just another among dozens.
Tommy!
As Tommy drove the barrel of his rifle into the gut of a lunging runner and pulled the trigger, some tiny part of his brain felt like someone was calling his name amidst the din of yelling and gunfire. With insensible logic, an ironic sense of clarity, Tommy almost calmly wondered if the God that he had never really cared about was now calling him home.
Tommy!
Not God. Like a steel rod through water, Joel's voice cut through the clamor, even as his hand wrapped around Tommy's shoulder. Tommy had just enough time to register Joel's bloody face and fingers before his brother shouted,
"Come on!"
and spun him around, pushing him towards the stairs leading up to the top of the wall. Whether it was the movement or Joel's sudden presence, Tommy felt his head clear. His rifle was slick with blood, but he gripped it like a lifeline as he used it to pummel and push his way through the thrashing mash of bodies. The steps were mercifully clear, but he could see soldiers fighting infected at the top, along the ramparts that ran the length of the wall. Still, it was a welcome alternative to the suffocating pit below. Tommy pounded up the stairs. As he neared the ramparts, he heard the sharp discharge of a revolver behind him, and saw a runner drop from the wall to the ground below. Tommy turned to look back at Joel and noticed for the first time that Javier was following them. He held his revolver aloft, smoke still wrapping around the barrel.
Saving your ass, eh, Tommy boy?
Javier huffed with an exhausted grin. For just a second, Tommy choked out a relieved laugh to see his friend still alive. Then he was back to scrambling up the stairs.
God damn it!
Joel growled once they had reached the top of the wall. Infected were clawing at soldiers on either side of them. Whichever direction they took along the battlements was blocked by runners. There had to have been dozens of them. Hundreds. More. The inhuman creatures writhed on the ground below and on either side of them, overwhelming soldiers, barricaders, and rioters alike. Huntersville was surely lost. Joel put a hand against the cement wall and leaned out to look to the ground outside the zone.
It's clear below,
he muttered. indescribably calm.
What?
Tommy said, eyes widening in disbelief.
It's 15 fucking foot drop below.
You got any other fucking ideas, Tommy?
Joel shouted angrily. Javier joined Joel at the wall, looking down below as well. To their right, a runner screamed as it caught sight of them and began galloping down the ramparts in their direction. Others began to follow suit.
Oh, hell.
Javier murmured in a strangled tone.
Nice fucking day for a jump, boys.
The three of them cast wide-eyed looks at each other, shook their heads, then hooked legs over the wall and vaulted over towards the ground below. End of chapter 4. Narration by P.P. Wrights. Full cast list in show notes. We do not own any copyrighted material, neither do we intend any infringement. Please support the official release.